What's going on? It's your boy DameSmiff, and this evening we're going to discuss a little bit of media censorship and media molestation and what it really looks like today in 2025. So if you're interested in conversations like this, make sure you hit the like button and make sure you subscribe and hit that button so that way you can see my latest videos. So what am I even going to talk about in terms of this topic? Well, there has been a big old uproar about Elon Musk buying X and Facebook and Google being a monopoly and all kinds of crazy stuff about media, censorship, and things like that, right? And I kind of wanted to draw your attention as the audience to kind of understand it better. Because when I see people having the conversation, they don't have the conversation objectively. So when you have a conversation, let's just take it to music, about censorship, there's things like drug use, violence, and sexuality and stuff like that. But the honest conversation that I would want you guys to have is that you are attracted to this kind of content. This is the exact content you want to see. You go to work and you get your paycheck to spend money on. And this is in almost every piece of media we have here in the United States. It's very rare you will find clean content. You almost have to filter for it, search for it. And so when I say something like media molestation, I don't even know if I'm making that term up or not, but if I am, here's the first time you heard it. But essentially, all I'm pointing out is that there is an exposure to maybe things that challenge or push your sensibilities that you may not consent to. And because you don't consent to it, that is a form of molestation if it's like of a sexual nature. Now, I want to broaden the term from the sexual side of it to being more so the traumatizing side of it. So, for example, if you were a middle schooler or elementary kid and some older kid brought a horror movie over to the sleepover, and the horror movie had one of these, topics in there, sexuality, violence, or drug use and things like that. 9 times out of 10, you didn't consent to that. And if you're going to go based on, the law, you're not old enough to consent to that kind of thing. So technically you were molested. And if it was a more extreme example where it was like a, fully adult film, explicit film, then yeah, that's what that goes under. And I had to look this up to be sure because it was kind of a weird situation where I was watching, I guess it was an interview or a podcast of an artist, and they were explaining how their childhood had a lot of experiences that led them to make certain decisions in the future. And I started to see this kind of repeat itself over and over and over again from different artists, different musicians, from, models, Instagram models, all these kind of things. It was like they would be exposed to something, and that exposure would trigger something, and then they would start making decisions. But it didn't interest me until I realized that they kept saying that a lot of the decisions they made, they felt like were wrong. Like they knew they were wrong in the first place. So I do want to break down how media kind of plays a role and how you need to be in control of the media you consume. Like me personally, I consume mostly YouTube, which is like podcasts and stuff like that, but I do pretty much search for the things I want to enjoy. Whereas there are a lot of people who just log into YouTube or Instagram and TikTok and things like that, and they just, let the app tell them what to watch and what to listen to. And so when we consider that, there is an opportunity there for you to be exposed to something you may not want to be exposed to. That's how these algorithms work. That's how marketing works. That's how company branding works. We expose you to things that may challenge your sensibilities or just excite you. And that's the whole point of getting your attention. So I'm going to go through and kind of break down the sexual aspect of it and the most molestation side of it, and then we'll get into the media side of it. And the reason I'm doing this first, because it's a little bit more of level setting of what happens when you're exposed to something. So in a very, very, very simple way, molestation often refers to the sexual acts with minors, which can include both physical contact and non-touching behavior. So we're going to focus on the non-touching behaviors in this video. But then my notes continue to say that federal law prohibits the production, advertisement, transportation, distribution, receipt, or sale, access with intent to view, and possession of child sexual abuse material underlying every sexually explicit image or video of a child is abuse, rape, molestation, or exploitation. Okay, so there's a federal law that has that, right? So you can't have any of this, right? Now here's goes the non-touching part. This category of child sexual abuse explicitly includes showing pornography to a child. So that is kind of the basis of this video. Whereas many of us have had like a cousin or some older kid in the neighborhood that had a adult video or even a horror film, or sometimes if you were born in the 90s, a legit snuff film sometimes in some cases. They would just show it to you. And oftentimes the prank or the point of them showing it to you was to see your raw reaction without, knowing what it is. So the surprise is the enjoyment they get from it. Now, in this example, this isn't a media company. This isn't some corporation. This is just some kid being a weird little kid, right? But if we exacerbate this example outwards to, let's say, social media, and maybe just some random 21-year-old who's scrolling through Instagram and then suddenly he gets a salacious picture sent in front of him, that necessarily wasn't for him to see. It wasn't directed. He didn't search it or anything, but boom, there it is, exposed. And everything that the brain does when it is exposed to that happens. So do we then ignore that occurrence, or do we compound it with the next occurrence and the next occurrence and the next occurrence? So I'll let you decide in the comments, where do you stand on being exposed to, let's say, adult content when you're not ready? I wouldn't even say adult, inappropriate, because some things that are adult aren't necessarily bad. They're just adult, like love making. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but shouldn't be no kids around that. So the next thing it says is exposing a person's genitals to a child. So again, non-touching, but just simply seeing, let's say, like butt, boobs, lower genitals and all that stuff. Just simply exposing that to a child is abuse. And encouraging a child to watch or hear sexual acts either in person or on video is, again, non-touching abuse. So I'm laying that out so that way when you are out and about and you are consuming media for yourself, you may not be a child, but you are being exposed to things that would be abusive to a child. So how does that work in terms of you being an adult, you deciding to watch the things you enjoy, and how does that work in terms of how you wind up getting the preferences you have? And then the last thing I have is there are legal definitions. Many legal definitions of child molestation and sexual abuse encompass showing pornography or sexual explicit material to a minor. For example, some statutes broadly cover immoral or indecent acts performed to or with a child in their presence. So I laid that out to kind of get us to understand, okay, so you can simply just show a video, show a picture, be in another room doing something inappropriate, and that would still be considered abuse. And then I'd say that to say this. So now when you turn on your television today, or you turn on YouTube today and you watch a, let's say, rap video or a rock video, and you suddenly see an image that, challenges your sensibilities. So for example, if you are a religious monogamous man and suddenly there are 4 women twerking with baby oil on, how are we supposed to, categorize that experience for you? Were you molested by the media? And should you turn it off, or should you accept it as just, common broadcasting as far as, what's acceptable today in society? Because there is a few different perspectives on that experience. So one person could say, well, you should be aware of pretty much the dangers of the world. In other words, guard yourself from such content, which would look like, setting up pop-up blockers, media blockers, maybe blocking certain websites from your social media site, certain channels from your TV network and things like that. You can also just cold turkey not watch TV. But there is a cultural understanding here, whereas you can leave your house and still have to guard yourself from all the other things. So for example, again, you can be a Christian monogamous man, but your coworker could be a degenerate, and you have to work with your coworker. And it would be kind of ignorant to think that you wouldn't talk to this person, you wouldn't communicate with them or cooperate with them And it would be kind of ignorant to think that some of their interests wouldn't bleed into yours, being that y'all are a cultural fit for the company you work for. To give you another example of that, that could be that your coworker, maybe you work in the same department, he watches sports, and you may watch, maybe you don't watch sports, maybe it's not your thing, right? But there's gonna come to a point where you guys are gonna have a conversation. It would be pretty ignorant to think that both of your interests would never come up, ever. So there is a conversation to be had there on that side. And then there's the other side of why would someone create such content and make it so readily available to the public? So if you were to consider, let's say, the BDSM community, the bondage, domination, sadistic, and masochist community, they are huge on consent. So if you are not consenting, if you're not a participating adult, there is a huge backlash you will get from that. That is a huge no. Never ever do that. You will almost be kicked out, disowned, and shamed for the rest of your life if you commit that big no of basically exposing somebody to something that they do not consent to. So that being said, there is an understanding that you should not be creating such content and then exposing the public to it. So if you are a girl who models on Instagram and you want to twerk or show your body or be sexual and, flirty and things like that, it would be a bit responsible for you to understand who can come across this, understanding the foundation we laid about how you can be, exposed to different medias. But again, you may not think that way. The person who's modeling their butt on Instagram or their boobs on TikTok, they may have in their mind that everybody else around them should block them if they don't want to see the content. So there is a bit of a cultural conversation there where if you want to protect, children or society's sensibilities, whose responsibility is it? Is it everybody's or is it one group? I don't know. So let me know in the comments. And then I have some more notes here where we kind of go through censorship, right? And why censorship may be important for, situations like this. Obviously, you want to protect the kids, but I'm speaking more so about adults that kind of fit certain sensibilities. And so in the 20th century, the Telecommunications Act of 1996, for example, significantly loosened ownership restrictions for radio and TV stations, leading to increased consolidation in the media industry. This meant fewer companies owned more outlets. In that sense, some forms of direct government content oversight might have decreased, but also led to less diversity in ownership. So in a nutshell, that basically means that if there was a point where the government wanted to get like a certain message out, like, hey, you guys need to get up and do 30 minutes of exercise a day. And, culturally, we didn't want to do that. We'd rather sit on the couch and eat chips. You don't have to hear that anymore because now a lot of media companies own the outlets independently. So now they can put out whatever they want. So you'll see things, fast forward to the future today, where you have black content, Latino content, Asian content, you'll have religious content, you'll have conservative content, liberal content, LGBT content, all kinds of things on TV, radio, and news, right? And they all generally can say what they want to say, give their perspectives on pretty much the same event. So if like a big old, I don't know, if a tidal wave hits New York City for some reason, all of these different people can give their perspective on it, right? And so what that then does is it reduces the common message that may be there. So you'll see things like if you ever see jokes about like communism where like the government tells everybody to do one thing and they all have to do it, there's less of that, but there's also disjointed information on what is really going on as far as a perspective. So it doesn't mean one's right or the other. It just means that because there are more people talking, more radio and TV outlets that are owned independently, you as an audience member have to be 10 times more intentional about what you consume because you could be getting the wrong information. You could be getting skewed information. Like it could be accurate but missing something. So you have to be very intentional about that. And then on the other hand, you also don't want to get all your information from one source. You want to get it from a variety of things so you can understand everything and get as much information and make the best decisions for, you, your family, or in this instance, as an artist, you can make the best decisions for you. And so the next thing I have is the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, still regulates broadcast media for obscenity indecency, and profanity, particularly during hours when children are likely to be watching or listening. See, okay, so they actually have this specifically set up for that, where they can generally understand that there are going to be children, or most children will be up at certain hours. But this is where that conversation about who's responsible comes back into play, because a lot of parents don't have bedtimes for their children. A lot of children have their own social media accounts. A lot of children have their own YouTube and Netflix accounts. So the data we're getting from a lot of these devices that we're watching media and listening to music comes directly from children. So we can't regulate, at least we haven't been able to regulate that you can watch profanity and obscene media, but we can kind of mitigate it. And that's with the help of parents and things like that, alongside tools like, firewalls and ad blockers and stuff like that. It helps protect people who should not see these things and people who do not want to see these things. And then it says, however, the interpretation and enforcement of these rules can fluctuate with different administrations and societal norms. Now, this was something I learned firsthand. The FCC does not stop hip hop radio stations down south in the United States from saying nigga. You can say the N word on mainstream radio in Memphis, Tennessee. You can do it. And I haven't really dug into why that is, but as much as a controversial word that is for the constituents of that area, you can say that word on the radio. And it has more to do with who gets to say the word than it actually being said. So I think that's what they mean by societal norms, which goes back to what I was saying. Whose responsibility is it for maybe children hearing that word, or maybe people who aren't black hearing that word, maybe people who don't like hearing the word having to hear that word? There's a societal norm where there's a group of people who probably are the majority that would prefer to hear that word, that would prefer to have music that says that word. Okay. And then that continues to say, while the fairness doctrine, which required broadcasters to present controversial issues in a balanced way, was abolished in 1987, debates about balanced coverage continues. So there was actually a doctrine made to try to get people to, if you're going to talk about, something that has undertones of race or maybe sexuality and things like that, try to cover it in a balanced way. But it was abolished in 1987. And you see today people talk about balanced news, fake news, and all that stuff like that. So again, you as a audience member need to be very intentional about what you're consuming. And so the FCC has been more focused on consumer issues like robocalls, data privacy in recent years, with new rules taking effect in 2025 regarding consent for marketing calls and text. This isn't direct content censorship, but it reflects an evolution in regulatory priorities. So robocalls and things like that were a big thing. I remember there was a while we had phone books and things like that. You can just look up people's information, dial a number, people would prank call each other. That's good and all that. But again, this is really a conversation about being exposed to things that aren't necessarily within your sensibility wheelhouse. And so now we can move on to current content mediums like social media and stuff like that. So this is where the landscape becomes particularly nuanced when we have private company moderation alongside government censorship. So I'll give you pretty much what my brain goes to when I hear private company moderation. I think of Target telling you that this new teddy bear is cool because it represents a certain group or something like that. That's private company moderation. So they get to tell you that this is cool, this is not cool. At our, coffee shop, we hire all women or something like that, right? Now, if you had that same company show a bunch of like hot models and nudes and they're twerking and stuff like that, I highly doubt that would be what their company is going to allow. So the way they would moderate their media is that there would be a lot of images and statements that would be balanced, but yet pro women, pro femininity and things like that. You wouldn't have a bunch of like balanced conversations about that because that's kind of what they're trying to market, right? And then government censorship is just across the board. We can't say certain slurs on TV, and you can't be shirtless on TV and stuff like that. But it says the First Amendment primarily protects individuals from government censorship. Private social media companies, however, are not bound by the First Amendment and can moderate content on their platforms based on their own terms of service. This has led to a widespread of debates about censorship by tech companies, particularly concerning misinformation, hate speech, and violent content. So, this is actually one of the things that most people don't consider. So you get up, go to work, and you don't think about this because the idea that having to watch what you say isn't necessarily enforced, right? So if you have a Facebook page or if you have a Xbox Live account or something like that, that's usually where you'll see a lot of enforcement happening on social media. But the issues these companies have is that sometimes it can step into sensibilities again. So like if a news outlet is covering a topic that doesn't really sit right with the demographic it's targeting, it's often viewed as the company doing something wrong, and that's not necessarily true. Sometimes these companies or these websites have, legit content and information they need to get out, but it's not pretty. Like it could be like maybe they're covering a war crime or maybe something really controversial when it comes to like a discovery. So that can be very, very problematic when it comes to how we feel about many things. But there are also websites and companies that their design is to push the boundaries of censorship. So there are websites that'll show like certain movies and only break up the scenes of certain movies, and it'll all be on the same category. So there will be a website dedicated to action movie shootouts, and it'll just be the coolest or weirdest or most action packed or best directed, just interesting movie shootouts all across that they can find. There's just a big library of the best stuff. Now, this is helpful for artists and things like that, or movie enthusiasts, because you can kind of get a catalog of what's out there. You can see how directors and movie makers actually create their products and understand angles and the science and the engineering, similar to what I do with concerts without sound on here. But the issue lies in when you start to move into categories that are, again, a little more sensitive. So there are the same versions of websites where they will only show violence. Like, well, I used shootout in my last example, but I'm talking like very, very realistic violence. So like they'll pull up films or have a website of just all films of just sexual violence or all films of extreme violence or movies that just resemble real violence. And then there's websites where they just show you outright just raw violence, like World Star or all these other websites like that are out there. World Star is the biggest one because it had a variety of content. It had music, short movies, viral fight videos, funny videos. It had a little bit of everything, but the censorship there again is privately owned. So they had the decision to put up violent content of women getting beat, men getting shot, all the kind of stuff, people getting stabbed. They can show that stuff because they legally can do it on their website. But you will never see that on like, nationally syndicated television because we don't want children seeing that thing. Now, when we talk about the responsibility over who's going to be censoring, then this is the part where you kind of get to place the responsibility on yourself. Who wants to see this content? Who is purchasing this content? Who wants to create this content? So if you see a fight on the street and you're thinking, oh man, I should get this on my phone, you're that person. If you see, some pretty girl walking down the street and she's wearing like a crazy sexual outfit and you pull out your phone, you are one of those people. And so it's hard for us to kind of really commit to understanding censorship sensibilities and how it affects others because there is an incentive to participate and there is an incentive to watch and to be a part of the spectacle as it is. And so there's also government pressure on social media where it says while the government cannot directly censor speech on private platforms, like we just said, there have been instances where federal officials have been in contact with major social media companies and encouraged them to remove content deemed misinformation. This blurs the lines between private moderation and government influence, leading to significant First Amendment questions that are currently being litigated. And I can understand people pushing that point, but I think the only issue that we can common sense come to is that if you're on Instagram and there is a page on Instagram that just denounces the government every day with just lies and the wrong information, and you can prove that they're lies and the wrong information, it would behoove you as a social media company to kind of handle that. And you see this a lot where you'll see streamers deal with this, especially with the company Twitch. You'll see streamers get really, really popular, and then we'll find out they're into some creepy, nasty shit or doing some weird shit on Discord, and the company won't do a thing. The company will still keep them there, which makes them money and pays that person. And what that will look like to some people is finding out your pastor is, committing a crime, but the church won't get rid of him. Finding out that your boss at work is stealing money from the cash register, but the company won't fire him. That's what that looks like. But then on the other hand, if your manager is stealing cash out the cash register and the police catch him, some people would believe that he should keep his job, even though he got caught by the police and served his time. So let me know how you feel. I don't know if somebody is making inappropriate, lewd, or spreading misinformation on social media and that kind of content. Should they be removed or held responsible, or are they just exercising their First Amendment and it's up to us to avoid whatever they're making as problematic? And then it also continues to say that Pew Research Center data suggests that public support for both technology companies and the government taking steps to restrict false information and violent content has grown in recent years. This indicates a societal push for more content moderation, even if it comes with free speech concerns. So in general, we don't want to be exposed to, violent content. We don't want to be exposed to sexuality without consent. We don't want to be exposed to gross, nasty things without consent. That's how we feel in general culturally. So then it goes back to who is making this content and why do they want to see it, and why do they want it to be so readily available to the public instead of placed in a shelf. So then we have censorship in libraries. There's a rising trend of attempts to censor digital content in schools and libraries for this exact reason, with activists using pornography as a basis to restrict access to ebooks and research resources. While often challenged as violations of First Amendment, these efforts represent a form of localized censorship. So parents don't want their kids going to the library, picking up an iPad or getting on the computer and mistakenly finding out that there's porn or things like that on the site. Now, obviously, there are some kids, as I used in my beginning example, there are some kids that will be bad kids and they will go look for this kind of content intentionally. But then that begs the question, should we give them the option to? Because if you believe no, then somebody would say that you're stepping on their First Amendment right to be able to either view this content or to be able to create this content. So let me know in the comments. Do you think not just children, but just, people in general, just general people you see out and about doing their job, should they be exposed to, let's say, like your sexuality or some weird freaky stuff, or Megan Thee Stallion bending over telling them to do some nasty stuff? Should they be exposed to that, or do we have to find some way to prevent them from being exposed to that for the sake of protecting their sensibilities, right? Just as a fellow, friend and human. And so I did have a few more notes here and then we'll wrap it up. And I have here that media companies in the US generally have significant issues with censorship, which is what we just went through, for several reasons. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution explicitly protects freedom of speech and of the press. For traditional media outlets, meaning newspapers, TV networks, and radio stations, this is a foundational principle. So they have no reason to, avoid this, right? Any government attempt to censor or restrict their content is seen as a direct challenge to their constitutional rights. They often litigate vigorously to defend this freedom. Now, mind you, it's a touchy subject because we're not dealing with something as extreme as, like, nudity or extreme violence or something like that. But this is important to fight because you could be doing something like just giving information, and the information could feel or be deemed as incorrect, and the government may try to step in. But if you do have the right to just present information, not necessarily tell you how to feel about it, but just present it, then you should be able to do so, at least in my opinion. And then I continue to say that media companies argue that they have the right to determine what content they publish, how it's presented, and what editorial stance they take. So if they feel that, Donald Trump is cool, they get to do that. So if they feel that he's not great, they get to do that. Censorship, whether by government or other entities, interferes with this independence and their ability to fulfill their role as gatekeepers of information and shapers of public discourse. So, one very important thing that stood out to me here was that it says censorship, whether by government or other entities. Who do you think the other entities are? Like when we think about people who will go up to a publication or a news station and interfere with their independence and their ability to fulfill their role as gatekeepers of information. That's how that was written. Who would do that other than the government? Let me know in the comments. So then it continues to say media companies see themselves as crucial to a functioning democracy, providing citizens with the information they need to make informed decisions. If their content is perceived as being censored or manipulated, it erodes public trust in their ability to deliver unbiased and complete news. And this happens so often where people watch Fox, people watch CNN, MSNBC, and they're just all skeptical. Not one, I don't know one news station that everybody generally says they get it right. You will see one side hate the other, one side hate another, and it just won't stop. It will never end. And that's why you as an audience member have to be very intentional, almost independently of these people, and just look at everything and figure out for yourself. Next, it says a free press, the watchdog function. A free press acts as a watchdog on government and powerful institutions. Censorship would severely hamper their ability to investigate, report on, and hold these entities accountable, undermining a core function of journalism. And that's the watchdog function. But there are a lot of different reasons that, affect censorship, our sensibilities, and what we're going to enjoy, and many things like that. And I think what really dictates this is that we tell these media companies what we want to hear. So, and they just kind of go with it. So if we tell them we want to hear more salacious news, they give us more salacious news. If we want to hear good things, they give us good things. The next, I want to get into how artists deal with censorship and things like that. So there is a bit of conversation about artist integrity, whether or not you're giving your full idea in a movie or in a song or a video and things like that. And my personal stance on it is that you can get any idea you want out and it can look the way you want it to look. It just shouldn't traumatize people. So for example, there are a lot of people in recent years that have been traumatized, like sexual assault victims, war crime victims, and just general victims of crime. They've begun telling their stories from their perspectives, but there is an issue with them not being as artistic in the storytelling. So for example, if a girl wants to tell her sexual assault story, artistically, we don't need to see the entire assault. We don't need to see the details that have nothing to do with educating us, right? So there is a complex misunderstanding between people who create art and people who consume it on whether or not you should be experiencing the art or it's experiencing the trauma. And I think a lot of filmmakers, especially, can't do this. I think they cannot do this. It's not that they know it and refuse to. I think they just lack these skills to be able to depict their visions artistically without trying to just be like heavy-handed and very surface level. And so with that, censorship may feel like a straitjacket to them. They feel like there's just nothing they can do because they lack the skills to simply just maneuver around it and do new things and create the same message. It's like if I was a painter and suddenly we start using iPads to paint. Does that now mean I don't know what I'm doing and I don't know how to paint anymore? No, you just adjust. So that's all censorship is to me. Is just, hey, look, we don't want you to do it that way. But what are you really saying? So, filmmaking is considered an art form, and censorship directly interferes with a director's, writers, and producers' artistic vision, forcing them to alter or remove scenes, dialogues, or themes that are integral to their storytelling. This can lead to a watering down of content, making films less impactful or authentic. So, this right here, though it is true, it's only one side of the story. So, where it says it can interfere with the director, writers, and producers' artistic vision, forcing them to alter or remove scenes, dialogues, or themes that are integral to their storytelling. I think of things that should not be there or do not tell the story or are not integral to the story. So, for example, if you have, again, like a sexual assault scene, do you think it behooves the audience to witness the entire assault or to understand it happened? So there is, I think, an issue. This is why I say I think a lot of producers and writers lack the skills. There is an issue where people think that when you're watching a movie, the immersion is you being the character. And that's not necessarily the case. That can be the case in some films, but that's not always the case. So if you want to have a certain goal or result for your audience, you need to be very clear, because that makes things like censorship a non-issue because you have skills. So moving forward, it says movies often tackle controversial or sensitive subjects like social justice, war, sexuality, and mental health. Censorship can prevent studios from exploring these themes truthfully and meaningfully, limiting their ability to provoke thought, spark dialogue, and reflect societal realities. Again, one side of this. Just because you're covering a topic such as social injustice, war, sexuality, and mental health doesn't mean that how you expose these things or have this conversation needs to be raw. It needs to be super authentic. It doesn't need to be that, because if you pay attention, if you are really a true artist and care, you pay attention, we will watch a Disney Pixar film by the millions. So it's not that we're attracted to your perspective on whatever topic you want to cover, social justice or war, sexuality. It's that we are looking for you to educate, tell us, or present something to us. So if what you're presenting, though it may be the truth, is hard to watch or unbearable or has terrible acting, bad lighting, or you're just not a good director, censorship is not your issue. And I think there is a correlation here between bad films and us needing to censor them, and then really good films that are a little bit controversial. Okay, I think we need to make it clear that censorship is not for really good films that are controversial. It's oftentimes for really bad films. And then the last point it has here is stifling innovation. Fear of censorship can lead to self-censorship, where filmmakers preemptively avoid certain topics or creative choices to ensure their film gets distributed. This stifles innovation and homogenizes content, making movies less diverse and daring. This can be true. And I think a lot of this does come from the fear of censorship. Like, if you really think your skills aren't good enough to get around, taking a scene out or rewriting a scene because, you want to get on a certain stage, again, I think you just lack the skills as a writer and a director, to where however your perspective is, you can't even deviate it for anybody else to understand, which means you just lack the skills. It is what it is. You just belong in a certain category with certain directors. It'd be like, for example, I'm a musician. If I can play jazz on the piano, if I can play R&B on the piano, and then I go to a show and somebody's playing traditional polka music, I will just understand that I don't have the skill to do that. Okay, I'm not going to be like, oh well, let me not play and have some kind of fear of playing. That's stupid in my opinion. I'm an artist and I feel like that's dumb. So any artist or director who's filming, you got a studio and you're hiring people to act for you, and you feel like censorship is the issue for you, you may lack skills. You may lack skills, not networking, not social skills. You may have some kind of understanding of what you want to put out in your film that is, it's hindering your thinking, and where you're bad at your job, because we see people with their cell phones making YouTube channels. So if you can't do it, then you might not be in the position. This would be like being in the NBA and complaining about bad sneakers. Like, just get better sneakers, like get your money up. I don't know what you want me to tell you. So economic impacts of censorship. Studios invest massive amounts of money in film production. That's pretty much the point. A significant obstacle due to censorship can directly impact their ability to recoup these investments, like the MPAA ratings. While not government censorship, the MPAA rating system can act as a de facto form of censorship. For example, an NC-17 rating, for example, severely limits a film's theatrical release, advertising opportunities, and overall profitability, as many theaters and retailers refuse to carry such films. So right there is the point I'm making. If your film receives an NC-17 rating, knowing that there is an MPAA rating system that you're functioning under means that you know that that's coming. Means that you know what stipulations are there for your film to meet this rating. And if you don't know, then you need to understand it and get understanding. So that way you don't do this and hinder your theatrical release, your advertising opportunities, and overall profitability. This is like reading a math book and putting the equation on the paper. So again, if you're a director and you have an issue with censorship and you think that, you know, a 3 or 4 minute sexual assault scene should be kept in your film, you just lack the skills to get it done, and just sit in the NC-17 category and do what you need to do with that. So moving on, it says studios often recut their films multiple times to achieve a more commercially viable R or PG rating, which makes sense. If you don't feel like you can change, or it doesn't make sense for your story to change certain dialogues and scenes and characters, just start cutting. And that's only because you care about getting this rating. If you don't care about the rating, then don't act like it's a problem. The next, it says the international market. There's a huge concern today in countries like China that have stringent censorship rules regarding political content, LGBTQ content, violent content, and other topics. To access these lucrative markets, China is often the second largest film market globally. Okay. Hollywood students, in order to access these markets, Hollywood studios frequently self-censor or create alternate versions of their films, often at a significant cost to meet foreign requirements. Failure to comply can mean a complete ban or a massive loss in revenue. So again, seems like something that if I was like a major studio, this would be a problem, where you see companies making like voiceover dubbed versions of their film. But again, if I have some kind of artistic vision and I think I'm supposed to protect my integrity as an artist, I wouldn't do this. I just wouldn't be in the Chinese market. If I'm that greedy, then I would start making all these changes and stuff like that. But if it was really about like this artistic vision that I have, and I think like my crazy scenes in my movies need to stay there, then again, censorship is not the issue. It's not the issue. We would just simply change where we move and how we move. And of course, audience reach. Censorship can restrict a film's audience. So if content is deemed too offensive or given a restricted rating, it limits who can see the film, rightfully so, thereby reducing potential ticket sales, streaming viewership, and ancillary revenue from merchandise. So reading this information, it would lead somebody with no moral compass to think that, oh, there is a problem with offensive content, and that's not true. These rules are here to protect people who A, don't want to see this content, and B, should not see this content. And that's kind of like across the board common sense, who should not want to see this content. But if you don't want to see this content, it's more so on an individual consent basis. But in general, these are good rules to have to protect society. And I think if you do have a problem with this, then that means that what you are asking for, which is what I said in the beginning, is something that you need to accept as weird and out of place for the common sense. Okay. So if you are into content or movies that most people generally call offensive, then you kind of have to accept that we're not going to change for you. No one's going to change for you. Okay. And we don't have to. So I say this to empower our filmmakers and our musicians and things like that. When you do see content that you don't agree with, or you find yourself making content that people don't agree with, just remember it's up to the artist why that content even exists. So if you see a female rapper and she wants to take her clothes off, turn around in her pictures and twerk and show her ass, and you don't know none of her lyrics, they chose that. If you see a rap group and there's a bunch of gang members and thugs and they throwing up little fingers and shit like that, and there's guns and drugs all in the music video, they chose that. They decided to do that. That's up to them. So what comes with that is also up to them. So if you never buy their albums, or if they wind up going to jail, or if they just look cute on Instagram and you never buy their music or you never watch these films, then that's up to the directors, filmmakers, and artists. And I do not give any personally, I don't give any grace to people who don't understand this, especially if you're trying to make money off of this. So let me know what you think. Do you think censorship is a great thing for music and entertainment in general, or do you think censorship is something that should be controlled individually? Or do you just hate people who don't want to see nasty stuff all day and you want everybody to just be exposed to all your traumas? Let me know in the comments.